Not long ago, a man appeared out of nowhere, carrying warnings about a future none of us were prepared to face. Tonight, we reopen the case of the man who claimed he came from that future, and the chilling predictions he left behind. Some say he was a hoax. Others believe he was humanity's last warning. His story leads directly to the year 2025, a year he described as a turning point for the world. So grab a snack, sit back, and let's dive into one of the most terrifying prophecies ever recorded. He never gave a real name, no photo, no proof. Just one detail: he called himself Titor. He claimed to be a soldier, a traveler from the year 2036, and his mission wasn't just to warn us, it was to explain something that no one in our timeline had truly understood. He called it the Divergence Points theory. According to Titor, the future is not a straight line. It fractures, he said, like a mirror struck by something unseen. Every major decision, every unspoken choice, every strange coincidence, they aren't random. They are moments of fracture, moments he called divergence points, invisible to us at first, but once crossed, the damage becomes irreversible. Titor claimed that after the turn of the millennium, Earth entered an era of accelerated divergence. At first, the changes were subtle, but each one opened the door to a darker, more unstable timeline, and here's where it gets even more unsettling. Titor revealed that the 2025 we are rushing toward is not the future we were originally meant to experience. It's an offshoot, a splintered reality born from missed signs and forgotten warnings, one where collapse, conflict, and catastrophe are not just possibilities, but accelerating inevitabilities. He even gave a chilling metric to measure how far we've drifted. When he arrived in our timeline, he calculated a world divergence factor of 2.5%. It sounds small, almost insignificant, but according to him, even a 1% divergence could twist reality beyond recognition over time. And here's a loop Titor never fully closed, something that remains unanswered even today. He hinted that certain events, still hidden from public view, would cause a final major divergence in the mid-2020s, a moment when two possible futures would fight for dominance, and only one would survive. But he never said what that event would be. He only left behind a cryptic warning. You will think you chose freely. You will think you understood, but by then, the real choice will already have been made for you. This raises a chilling question we'll return to later. Are we already past the final divergence point, or is the moment still ahead, hidden in the days and months to come? And if it is still ahead, would we even recognize it before it's too late? Prepare for the sky to go black, not from night, but from memory. At first, it was dismissed. Another metaphor, they thought. Until years later, a user managed to connect it with a later post Titor had made under a different alias, where he spoke of the Eclipse protocol, an event supposedly scheduled for December 2025. According to Titor, this wasn't a solar or lunar eclipse. It wasn't an astronomical event. It was a technological one. He claimed a coalition of global powers, unknown to any public record, would initiate a blackout of the global consciousness grid. In his future, humanity had begun developing something called mass neural synchronization. The result? A global blackout of memory. Not data, not electricity. Memory. People forgot who they were, what year it was, what side of history they belonged to. Governments collapsed without a single bullet being fired. It wasn't destruction. It was disconnection from identity, from purpose, from reality itself. And the most chilling part? Titor claimed this was scheduled to begin with a false celestial event, an artificial eclipse visible from major cities across the globe, a signal that the mind wipe had started. And in his most cryptic line, he said, "If you look up and see darkness where there should be light, run. Your memories are no longer your own." Among the lesser-known fragments of Titor's transmissions was a line that puzzled even the most dedicated researchers. When they find the Omega Archive, time itself will hesitate. What was the Omega Archive? Titor never explained it directly. He never said where it was or who they were, but he left clues, scattered references to buried data vaults, sealed in deep subterranean bunkers across what he called the temporal safeguard zones. According to his posts, these vaults didn't just contain human knowledge, they held proof of events that haven't happened yet, records from futures that we never lived through. He claimed some of these events had already been erased by timeline interventions, yet echoes of them still existed in those vaults. Images of cities that never were, speeches by leaders we never elected, natural disasters we never experienced. But all of it, he insisted, real, in some version of Earth. And here's where the prophecy becomes truly disturbing. Titor warned that in late 2025, an organization, unnamed, only referred to as the Custodians, would unearth one of these Omega archives beneath the polar ice. And once accessed, something would change. Not with technology, not with politics, but with time itself. The moment they read what's inside, he wrote, time will hesitate, cause will forget effect, memory will shatter, reality will rewrite, but no one will know it happened. This prophecy wasn't about a war. It wasn't about disease or climate or economics. It was about a rupture in the fabric of reality, a moment when time would hiccup, reset, as if the universe were catching itself in a lie. And Titor's final note on this thread, just 6 words: you won't remember the reset, but you'll feel it. He never tried to prove himself with grand gestures. He didn't beg for attention. In fact, he answered questions almost reluctantly, like someone who wasn't trying to convince, just to document. Sent back in time on a classified mission to retrieve a piece of technology critical for survival. Not to save the world, not to become a hero, just to do a job. At first, it sounded like the perfect online hoax. A bored teenager, maybe. A prankster who read too much science fiction. But the more he spoke, the stranger things became. Where America would face growing internal conflict. Where divisions between states would widen into deep fractures. Where natural disasters, political unrest, and economic instability would converge into what he called a soft collapse. Not a sudden explosion, but a slow unraveling. Some of his smaller predictions seemed impossible at the time, but years later, they began to look disturbingly accurate. He spoke of an American crisis around the year 2005, a breakdown in international alliances around 2015, and a sharp rise in global surveillance technology that would change everyday life after 2020. He didn't describe these events like a fortune teller. He spoke about them like a man recalling distant memories, calm, factual, uncaring if anyone believed him or not. But through all his cryptic warnings, there was one year he kept circling back to, 2025. He didn't say much, almost like he was afraid to, but he hinted that something would happen then, something bigger than wars, bigger than governments falling, something that would force humanity to choose between extinction or transformation. What exactly was this event? Why was 2025 so critical? And most importantly, was John Titor really a time traveler, or something even stranger? At first glance, his early posts seemed like a jumble of futuristic tech talk. He spoke about obscure machines, like the IBM 5100, a 1970s computer almost nobody remembered. Titor claimed that it was critical to his mission because it contained hidden capabilities that modern machines lacked, capabilities needed to debug the broken systems of his time. Years later, real IBM engineers would confirm that the 5100 did have undocumented features, unknown to the public, features that could have powerful implications for decoding complex systems. First breadcrumb, hidden in a machine forgotten by history. But it wasn't just technology. Titor described America's political climate shifting toward fragmentation. He warned of increasing internal conflicts, growing distrust in government, and isolated pockets of rebellion that would eventually boil over. At the time, in the early 2000s, the idea seemed ridiculous. The country was riding high on post-Cold War dominance. The internet was booming. The economy was stable. There were problems, sure, but nothing that looked like collapse. Then came the fractures, financial crises, deepening cultural divides, the slow, grinding erosion of trust in institutions, movements rising not from foreign threats, but from within. Titor also hinted at a period where international alliances would crumble, replaced by a cold pragmatism between nations. He described a world where loyalty to old treaties and agreements faded, replaced by survival-driven politics. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, we watched former allies drift apart, nations retreating inward, global cooperation weakening, the early seeds of global fragmentation, exactly as he described. Perhaps most chilling of all, he talked about a shift in human behavior itself. He warned that technology would not just change how we communicate, it would change who we are. That surveillance would become so embedded in daily life, people would stop noticing it. That freedoms would quietly be traded for convenience. Today, we live in a world where every movement, every purchase, every word online leaves a permanent trail. Smart devices listening, cameras everywhere. Data collected, sorted, and sold before most people even wake up, not through some dramatic dystopia, but through small convenient steps, bit by bit, breadcrumb by breadcrumb. It's easy to brush all of this off as coincidence. Easy to say, anyone could have predicted some of these things, and maybe that's true, maybe. But there was something different about the way Titor spoke. He never claimed to predict the future like a prophet. He described it like a tired witness, someone who had lived through it, survived it, but carried the scars. And now, with 2025 looming closer, the final and most terrifying breadcrumb is coming into view. Moment that would force humanity to make an irreversible choice. He never fully explained what it was, but from the pieces he left behind, a terrifying picture begins to emerge. Something that could shatter governments, something that could change the very structure of society. Not a single event, but a cascade, a domino falling into 100 others. And if Titor was right, then the signs are already around us, growing stronger every day. The question now isn't whether the future he described is coming. It's whether we're too late to stop it. Because according to John Titor, the clock ran out long before 2025 ever arrived. By now you're probably wondering, what did John Titor actually say about 2025? The truth is, he didn't hand us a clear map. He didn't list exact dates or names. Instead, he left fragments, clues hidden in cryptic conversations, layered hints meant to be pieced together only when the time was right. And maybe that time is now. Titor spoke of a fracture point, a year where the future would no longer follow a single timeline, where choices made at critical junctures would splinter reality itself, sending humanity down wildly different paths depending on decisions barely visible at the surface. He described it like a pane of glass under pressure, invisible cracks forming, tiny stresses that no one notices, until suddenly it shatters. And 2025, he said, was the year the first deep cracks would be impossible to ignore. But what causes the fracture? Titor was vague. Some think deliberately. He hinted at 3 escalating crises colliding at once: a global technological reckoning, a new wave of AI and automation that would sweep away millions of jobs faster than society could adapt. Systems once thought unbreakable would falter under the strain, leaving entire industries gutted almost overnight. A widespread resource crisis. Not sudden famine, not one catastrophic drought, but a gradual, undeniable reality. Too many people, not enough critical resources. Water, energy, minerals, the silent lifeblood of civilization, running thinner by the year. An internal collapse of trust. He spoke of growing suspicion, not between nations, but among citizens themselves. A time when truth would become a weapon, when even the most basic facts would be twisted until reality itself became contested territory. And when all 3 of these forces peak, when technology, survival, and trust collapse together, Titor warned the fracture would finally open. Societies would face a binary choice, not left or right, not good or evil, but survival at any cost or collapse. Some would cling desperately to old systems, even as they crumbled. Others would break away, forming isolated, self-governed regions, city-states, fortified communities, fractured nations, a patchwork future replacing the world map we know today. And once that fracture happens, there's no going back. It wouldn't be like the wars of the past, he said. There would be no grand declarations, no single cataclysmic moment. Instead, a slow-motion disintegration, one quiet snap after another, until one day we would wake up and realize the world we knew was already gone. Titor's warnings didn't name specific leaders or predict exact battles. Instead, he painted a feeling, a world where uncertainty is no longer a phase, but the permanent state of existence. When he spoke of this fracture back in 2000, it sounded like science fiction. Today it sounds like tomorrow's headlines: civil unrest growing, supply chains under strain, technological shifts leaving millions scrambling to catch up, truth itself bending and breaking under the weight of conspiracy and distrust. One by one, the cracks Titor spoke of are appearing, and the pressure on the glass keeps building. He said by the time most people noticed the fracture, it would already be too late, that once the first crack ran deep enough, nothing could stop it. And 2025 is when that first crack was destined to split the surface. After warning about the coming fracture of 2025, John Titor didn't just leave us with images of collapse. He spoke of what came after, who survives, and more disturbingly, who doesn't. Titor described a future where survival wasn't about wealth, power, or influence. It wasn't about who held the biggest armies or who owned the most land. Survival, he said, belonged to those who could adapt. He talked about small, tight-knit communities rising from the ruins of fractured nations, people who rejected the failing promises of the old world and learned to live locally again, growing food, managing their own energy, securing their own water. Technology wouldn't vanish, far from it, but it would change hands. Instead of sprawling tech giants controlling it from glass towers, advanced technologies would be decentralized, adapted by everyday survivors to protect and sustain their communities. Solar arrays stitched together from salvaged parts, homemade filtration systems to purify dwindling water supplies, decentralized communication networks built from scratch, away from the crumbling internet monopolies. Those who tried to cling to the old ways, sprawling cities dependent on endless imports, governments demanding loyalty without offering real protection. They would, in his words, fade like echoes. The survivors of 2025 and beyond wouldn't live comfortably, but they would live freely. And then came one of the eeriest parts of Titor's warnings. He spoke of the roamers, groups who refused to settle at all, nomadic bands, some peaceful, some ruthless, moving across abandoned highways, living off the skeleton of the old world, some driven by necessity, others by belief, convinced that staying in one place was a death sentence in a fractured future. Among them, new ideas would be born, new governments, new technologies, new religions even, shaped not by ancient traditions, but by the trauma of watching the world fall apart. Titor never fully explained whether these roamers were heroes or villains. Maybe because, in the world after 2025, those labels wouldn't matter anymore. It wasn't about good or evil. It was about who could endure and who could not. But there was one thing he made chillingly clear. The people who survived didn't do so by accident. They were the ones who had already learned to think differently, who understood that when the fracture hit, waiting for someone else to fix it would be a death sentence, and perhaps the most unsettling part. Titor claimed that some survivors would already feel the shift in the early 2000s and 20s, even before the fracture made itself visible. A gut feeling, a sense of something fraying beneath the surface, a quiet certainty that the future was no longer guaranteed. And maybe, just maybe, the reason you're here, watching this video, listening to this story, is because somewhere deep down, you've felt it too. In Titor's world, the fracture of 2025 wasn't just a natural disaster. It wasn't just political chaos. It was the death of trust on a global scale. Governments collapsed, not because they were attacked, but because their people simply stopped believing in them. Titor spoke of the Great Silence, a period where once mighty institutions suddenly lost their grip overnight. It wouldn't come with marching armies or fiery revolutions. It would come quietly. First, people would turn off the news. Then they would stop following orders. Then they would stop paying taxes. Then they would stop voting altogether. It would be a domino effect. As one system failed, it would pull down the next. Banking systems would freeze. Electric grids would fail in strange, cascading blackouts. Military bases would stand abandoned, not from defeat, but from desertion. Titor described a moment when official broadcasts would keep repeating, "Remain calm. Assistance is coming." Long after everyone knew, no assistance was ever coming. He mentioned entire cities simply fading away, not burning, not collapsing in some dramatic war, but being abandoned, empty buildings standing like tombstones to a forgotten era. And strangest of all, he spoke about the echo leaders, figures that would rise not by elections or battles, but by presence, not presidents, not kings, but individuals, some ordinary, some infamous, who would simply step into the void left behind. Some would offer real help, organizing food, protecting families, rebuilding communities. Others would be far darker, using fear, superstition, and raw power to rule over desperate survivors. Titor warned, "In the world after 2025, it's not who speaks the loudest that leads. It's who speaks when no one else dares." The most mind-bending part? Titor claimed this collapse wouldn't feel like a single big event. It would feel gradual, almost invisible, until one day people would wake up and realize the old world was gone. No announcement, no headlines, just a quiet, irreversible shift into something new and deeply unfamiliar. And now, the question, the one Titor feared we'd never ask until it was too late. Are we already past the final divergence point? Titor never gave a clear answer. In fact, that was the most terrifying part. He said that the final divergence point isn't something you see happening. It's something you only realize once it's too late.